Hello, and welcome to the Tifo Football podcast. I am Joe Devine, and today I'm joined by Alex Stewart, who is here to tell us who we are supported by.
Hi, Joe.
Hi,
this
Alex.
episode, and indeed this podcast, is supported by The Athletic.
It is indeed.
It's the home of the best coverage of your club by a world-class team of writers, including many of your favourites from across the Premier League.
All of my favourites.
All of your favourites. You should get reading now with a 30-day free trial by visiting theathletic.co.uk/Tifo. And you get 50% off if you sign up before the end of August. The Athletic is the new home of football writing.
It is, and it's that with that sign-up offer, I think it's the equivalent of 8p a day.
Apparently so.
So do support the Tifo Football podcast by supporting The Athletic. That is www.theathletic.co.uk/Tifo. Today's episode is a special one. Alex and I had a lot of fun recording it.
It is a special one.
It is a special one.
Really special.
We were joined earlier on by David Goldblatt. I was about to call him infamous, but that sounds sounds rude. The famous David Goldblatt, famed, of course, for his authoring of such titles as The Ball is Round, that one on the Olympics, and a new book that we talked to him about today. I do know the titles. I'm doing a joke. What was the name of the book that we are? The Age of Football that we were talking about today.
And he's also done Football Nation about Brazil and The Game of Our Lives.
You can see if you're watching The Age of Football here, it's meaty, so I didn't read it, and Alex read as much as possible before David Goldblatt arrived over the course of a few days.
Yeah, I was going to say, before David Goldblatt arrived makes it sound like I was sat in here half an hour before going, fucking hell, I've got to get through it.
Well, not including the notes.
It's 600 pages long or something.
Yeah, it's 600 pages long. Yeah. The Ball is Round is similarly mammoth.
Hold on.
You can see that as well there, The Ball is Round. But The Ball is Round is absolutely fucking amazing.
Yeah.
And I haven't read this, but from the conversation we had today with David Goldblatt, I imagine it is equally amazing. The Sunday Times says, David Goldblatt. David Goldblatt is possibly the best football historian there has ever been.
It's not possibly.
It is.
He just is.
Yeah. But it was a real pleasure to speak to him. He was very accommodating and very interesting, and the conversation ranges from football in Africa to Qatar to Europe, much as the book does. And we tried to get from him a good sense of what the book is about. It's very broad and wide-ranging. So it's actually, in some ways, it's like, I was reading the synopsis earlier, it's even difficult, I imagine, unimaginably difficult to write a synopsis for the book. But he describes it as a sort of second part to The Ball is Round. So it doesn't mean you need to have read The Ball is Round. If you haven't, though, you absolutely should.
It's also, what's cool is that the book's not actually out for at least 2 weeks. I think he said the 5th of September. So by listening to him talking about this, you're getting a kind of sneak peek of everything that's in it.
It's an exclusive.
It is an exclusive.
There's a pre-order link in the description, by the way, if you want to pre-order.
And I promise you, and I'm not saying this for any reason other than I believe it firmly to be true, that if you buy it and read it, you will not be disappointed. Yeah. It's really, really good.
But as I said, we were absolutely delighted to have him in. It was a real pleasure for us, a lot of fun, and I hope you enjoy it too. So without further ado, here is David Goldblatt. David Goldblatt, what book have you written?
I've written The Age of Football, the Global Game in the 21st Century.
Right.
There it is.
If you're watching, you'll be able to see Alex holding that up.
And it's the sequel, really, to The Ball is Round, Global History of Football, which I published in 2006. Yeah. And most of the stories and the narrative of that book peter out around the turn of the century. Yeah. And, that's 20 years ago. And the world is looking very different from the world of the year 2000. I mean, it's remarkable. The Ball is Round doesn't mention Twitter. No. Facebook is not in there. And, the course of global capitalism is looking very different. And indeed, the nature of football. So it felt like it was time to go back and sort of bring us all up to date.
Yeah.
And so it's a survey of the state of football everywhere over the last 20 years. I think I go, probably 100 countries get a look in.
A whole 100?
Well, probably more actually. I mean, Africa, like the world is big and complicated, and football is played absolutely everywhere.
Yeah.
So, Africa, 55 countries, even if you're, only doing half of them, that's 27, that's one continent. So, So we talked about this a little bit beforehand. Alex is full steam ahead reading through the book. It's not out yet. It comes out on the 5th of September, that's
I think. Right.
Yeah.
And I've read the introduction. So
thank you very much.
And can I tell you the most fascinating thing about the introduction to me?
Please.
I love this bit because it's something, and I don't want to compare you to David Icke at all, but I spoke to David Icke once years ago, and something he said to me was that for him, football was a kind of microcosm of society. And he said something very similar to something you say in the introduction here, which is that football in some ways is one of the easier industries, I suppose, to... It makes what people are doing in terms of the structure of the game and capitalism, which we spoke about before, slightly more transparent than it is anywhere else, or at least there's an easier access to it because so many people are part of it. What is it about football, do you think, that makes that the case? And presumably you agree that it's one of the best things to be able to examine the rest of the world through the lens of?
Sure. Well, good question. I think the first thing is that it's just everywhere. So, comparison always reveals interesting things, and illuminates your own situation. People look up above where you are now. The world is different. Football was organised, played, experienced, consumed differently somewhere else. It puts what you experience as an everyday reality without reflecting on it into perspective. Things can be different. It's a kind of jolt to consciousness, I think. And I think one of the things of the last 20 years, the globalisation of football, is that most people in the world who consume football don't just consume one kind of football, or play or follow it. I mean, everybody's kind of checking in everywhere in all sorts of ways. And I think that alerts people to the complexity of the world. So I think that's one of the reasons that football delivers that. I think in some ways it's it's less impenetrable to most people. I mean, really, if you really want to get to grips with global capitalism, you should probably start with finance, but that's very difficult. So football just sort of opens it up in a way, and people bring a lot of practical, personal reflection and experience and knowledge. It's a very kind of, I think the football audience, is complex and multifaceted, but there's a lot of reflection, a lot of knowledge, a lot of learning actually going on out there. People remarkably well informed. Yeah,
particularly in finance, right? I mean, I think people find an interest, as it relates to their specific club, maybe in the most case, but they find an interest in financial transactions and the way that works in football, particularly in the Premier League, in a way that they never would with the world at large, or they maybe wouldn't. The
supermarket that they kind of use on a daily basis. Right. Football kind of illuminates it, and I think what I found in writing the book is that while economic and political power and institutions have always taken a pretty sharp interest in football, the degree to which they have engaged and indeed colonised football in the last 20 years is historically unprecedented. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's sort of staring one in the face, when you have nation states making the ownership of football clubs, a central element of foreign policy. When you have, China, the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party, extraordinarily powerful and influential institution, publishes a plan for the rise of Chinese football that makes the qualification for hosting and winning of the World Cup official markers of social and economic progress. Yeah. Like, what is going on?
So can we start
looking you
then
in the face
with what's in it what's in it for them in that? Let's take China as a specific example. Like, why so much government involvement in football? There are plenty of others. I think Erdogan appears in your book as well. Maybe we can talk a little bit about him. But what's in it for these people? It might be obvious, but
so lots of things. I mean, there's lots of opportunities to grandstand, of course. There are a way of communicating with the public and engaging with the public in a way that very few other things seem to offer. Ready-made identities, certainly in established football cultures that one can piggyback on or incorporate into one's own story. At some levels, it's just about cultivating a kind of public persona of ordinariness, which is a real difficult for elites everywhere. So Erdogan, for example, the previously Prime Minister, now President of Turkey, has made the playing of football and conversation about football, part of his everyday political persona when engaging with the public. And he's done very well on that.
On that, I found it really interesting that in the chapter on Africa, where obviously Chinese investment is another thing. I've been to Malawi and seen the stadium that they've built there, but you talk about how various African leaders have kind of got behind Premier League sides. Was the first tweet of one particular leader was
William Rufo,
in support
Vice
of
President.
Arsenal.
That's Kenya.
What's going on with Arsenal? Why do you think those leaders are showing their kind of street cred or showing their demotic credibility with a Premier League club rather than with an African club? Because you talk a lot about how there's a huge importance of particularly Premier League football in Africa, often to the detriment of the support of local games. Why are they doing that? Why are the leaders doing that? Why are they not encouraging, because against a backdrop of colonialism, you would expect them actually to harness that kind of African power movement and say, no, we need to support your local Ghanaian team or your local Nigerian team or whatever it is.
I think partly there is, at one level, certainly amongst some of those folks, just a genuine love, obsession with football. This goes very deep in Africa, and so in that sense, they're kind of just like quite normal in some ways. They're part of a bigger sort of phenomena. Some of them, I think there is a degree of grandstanding. No one is going to engage in African football at the moment, politically, as far as I can see, because it's considered pretty much a lost cause, I think, amongst those political elites. The hollowing out of sub-Saharan African football, economically, in terms of who's where the players are, in terms of people, what people are watching, the choice they have through the arrival of satellite television, has devastated it. And it is a very, very poor spectacle. It is a measure in many countries in Africa. It's an exemplar of what's gone wrong and what the problem is, and no one wants to go there.
Is it almost fair to say, that there are, and this is in no way to criticise some, the reason I went to Malawi was to go on a scouting trip with a footballing academy there called Ascent Soccer, who find young Malawian kids and give them an education if they're good at football and try and develop them. There's also Right to Dream, who have an arrangement with, in fact they own Norgeland now, set up by a guy called Tom Vernon. But these are Western actors in Africa, kind of recognising that domestic football there is in a perilous state, but there is talent. There are players that are worth looking at.
Oh, sure.
Is it kind of almost, this is perhaps quite a spiky way of putting it, but it's a recolonialisation of aspects of the African experience, but through the vehicle of football?
You can consider it colonial. I think it's certainly a sort of centre-periphery thing, is that money, power and talent are being sucked from the football periphery to the football centre, above all to Europe, but not just to Europe. African players are spread all across Asia, in Indonesia, in Laos, in Kampuchea, in Burma, and across the kind of, Arabic-speaking world as well. So I think it's sort of partly a function of, it's a capitalism thing, rather than just an imperial thing. people, it's a kind of complex interaction between European football, particularly the Premier League, and African football cultures. People in Africa feel like they're taking possession in some ways of it. They don't feel that it's just being kind of dished out. They feel like active contributors to the culture.
And is that
in the depth of their following and their kind of level of engagement?
And presumably harnessing that to, you talk about the importance, for example, of Didier Drogba in the Côte d'Ivoire and how pervasive he is as a presence. They're harnessing that to, they're seeing an African player going to Europe and doing phenomenally well and kind of almost imaginatively hitching themselves to that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's, it's one of the great models of social success, in contemporary Africa, is to be a football player and, to then come back and play the big man, as many of the players do, some in a very negative way, some in a super positive way. Michael Essien has kind of built like a hospital and sorted out the sewage for his hometown, and Drogba has made those kind of contributions, as well. I think the interesting thing about those guys is that while they come back at least some of the time, and they do try and re-engage with local football cultures, the football associations are incredibly reticent to actually let them have any power or significance, because they're a threat, and they bring different standards and different expectations, and they're kind of more incorruptible in a sense because they've made their money. And so, you see it at the African Cup of Nations, how few African coaches still there are. When you've got this wave of talent, and a lot of very smart players as well who have, learned the ropes in Europe, but they're not coming, that talent is lost, because they prefer to keep, the untalented but connected in power. And that's one of the great shames. And I think that's also true, of the finances of African football, is that so few players are coming from Africa, from clubs in effect, who then, would get some of the transfer fee back, and that in some way would recirculate into African football and perhaps have infrastructural consequences or, consequences for the, state of play. But someone, like Kanu, who actually had a short-lived, but nonetheless a short-lived career in professional football in Nigeria. Kids are now coming out straight out of private academies of one sort or another, particularly in West Africa, where the bulk actually of the best players are coming from. And very little money is kind of recirculating enough to, people's families do well, agents do well, the academies do well, but you're not seeing that money circulate back. So it's an incredibly one-sided encounter between African football and the rest of the world.
Is there anything on the horizon other than a pretty negative kind of outcome where actually ultimately domestic football in many parts of Africa just dies? Ghana is always going to have Hearts of Oak and so on, but that you can see, or you could understand.
Ghana's had very little football of any kind for the last year, since the film depicting all the leaders of the Ghanaian Football Association taking bribes turned into a feature film. I think it was called 18. So Ghana football has been suspended.
Right.
So even Ghana, where there is some money, there are clubs of long established and powerful local identity. There are real problems. Is it possible? There are some good news stories. So it just kind of depends, what the bar is. So Kenya is a relative success story, where you've got the Kenyan Premier League being formed in the first decade of the 21st century, where basically the clubs take control. And they're all equal partners and equal shareholders in the Premier League. So they all have an interest in basically transparency and doing a deal with each other without someone skimming stuff off the top, which was always the way with the Kenyan Football Association. So the Kenyan Premier League, is now well organised. Fixtures happen when they're meant to. The level of violence is diminished. Players are earning a wage. It's not great. And it has some sort of integrity, and of course it's still competing, on the television with the rest of the world, but it is kind of, it has survived at the very least and kind of sorted itself out.
Football is happening.
Yeah, football is happening. It's a functioning operation. Somalia is an interesting case where Somalia has had a really tough time for the last 20 years. It's a miracle that football can that happen, particularly because both the Union of Islamic Courts and then Al-Shabaab, who have been the main jihadi groups fighting in Somalia, have had, at best an ambiguous relationship to the game and have often banned it from the areas under their control. But the Somali League at the moment is, they took the decision, we don't play when the Premier League European football is on, so we're on a different timetable. And local businesses have put up enough money again to cover, you've got a professional league. And they pay on time. You pay regularly to pay on time, and that means Zambians and Nigerians. It's like, yeah, we'll have some of that.
You made that point with the evangelical church team.
Miracle of
we did a video
Mountain of Fire and Miracles.
Yeah, that actually simply being organised, disciplined, and paying people on time in African football is actually often enough to achieve success.
It gets you a long way. I mean, FIFPro, the global trade union for professional footballers, published a report in 2016, and it was a survey globally of players and the conditions under which they operate. And 90% of players in the DRC don't have a contract. More than half have been attacked or suffered some sort of violence or abuse in the course of their professional career, from fans or police or so it is, it's tough, and not getting paid late. I mean, this is just the norm. I mean, think, when Nigerians and Cameroonians are going in their droves to play in Laos, I mean, something is not right at home. That is not an easy place to go, nor is it, to Bangladesh. Bangladesh is paying better than Nigeria. So yeah, there's simply paying something and paying it on time, will get you a long way. I mean, it's worth noting there's a third success story, which is TP Mazembe in the DRC. Which is a sort of older model of patronage politics, but when the governor, Moises Katumbi, of the region, takes the club over in the late 2000s and puts some serious money behind it, sort of like 30 million a year, which in global terms is not a big deal. They make it all the way to the final of the World Club Cup. I mean, they were really good. They had, all the Zambians who won the 2012 African Cup of Nations, the best of Congolese players who otherwise, for sure would have been playing in Belgium or France or whatever. And for 5 or 6 years while the money was flowing and the politics was stable enough for this thing to happen, extraordinary success. They were very good. Crowds were back in the stadium. I'm not necessarily advocating that as a model for everywhere, but it's an indicator that, with a modicum of stability and some money, then African football has, still has actually great potential. But the conditions under which that can happen are very difficult to kind of generate.
Also, one of the other, I think we covered this a few months ago now, but it was a story about a particular group of agents who were going over to Africa, West Africa particularly as well, and promising football contracts with Western football clubs in France and Belgium and places to young kids who were between the ages of sort of 14 and 17, but asking the families to put up a bit of money beforehand for the travel and for the agents' fees and all the rest of it. And many of the kids, when they arrived in Europe, it was either, in best case scenario, it was for a trial, which was an open trial, and maybe if you had some talent, you might get picked up. But the vast majority of them ended up homeless, living on the streets. The dream of playing was just a total myth, and the communities were being abused basically by a series of agents. Did it come up in your research at all, those sorts of stories?
It's a widespread phenomenon.
Yeah,
it's a widespread phenomenon. Thousands and thousands and thousands of kids, and there are a lot of unscrupulous agents and middlemen all over Africa pulling this trick. And there are those who, sign up because they really believe it and they've got the football talent. And there are others, it's worth saying, who are looking at it and going, well, I could be doing the Mali, Niger, Libya across to Italy in a boat routine. Maybe I'll take my I'll take my chances. Yeah. And there is a bit of that as well. So there are lots of people who are properly duped, and there are others who, that's how desperate the situation has got in West Africa. You see that in Libya, in the boats of refugees in the Mediterranean. That's the real sociological phenomenon driving, will do anything, will take any chance. People are not fools. They know agents a lot of the time are up to no good, but you might take the chance as well. No, it's tragic.
Yeah. And is it relatively new as a phenomenon? It's sort of as a broader point, you said the ball is round finishes around 2000, and in your chapter on Europe, you talk a lot about 98 through to 2006 being a period of kind of real optimism. UEFA seemed to have its shit together, and there were reforms being made. Things were moving in the right direction, albeit not necessarily in Eastern Europe where there's endemic corruption and so on. And there are some interesting examples of that. But it feels like kind of and this is maybe going back to the first point that we made, as the world has got worse in like a really basic way, the stuff around football has got worse as well. And the negative aspects of globalization, whether that's piggybacking for human trafficking or money laundering or the involvement of organized crime or just that kind of financial echelon of, you talk about bankers being like footballers, there's this kind of super wealthy coterie that are just above the rest of us. That's all post all this that period of optimism, isn't it? And, and the human trafficking, is that part of that as well? Is that post
human trafficking? I think really this has been going on since the late 90s. Foot Soldat, who is the NGO that deals with some of these issues, set up I think a Cameroonian player. Is operating in the early 2000s. So I think there are examples of this in the 90s for sure. As with the flows of migrants, it's been growing and growing and growing over the last 20 years. I think, it's interesting you pick that up, the optimism of the early 2000s before the financial crash, because in some ways, while you're right, there are many problematic elements of football that have got worse since 2006. I think it's worth remembering the football itself at the very peak of European football, I would say, this is the most extraordinary football ever played. I think the teams that have dominated the Champions League over the last 10 years and the upper echelons of the leading 4 or 5 leagues, this is off the scale.
How do you quantify that?
Well, let's just, the speed at which the game is being played, the quality of the surfaces on which the game is being played, the level of fitness of players, the amount they're running, the amount they're sprinting, the number of passes and touches in the game, I think is just absolutely, we know statistically those are all just like much, much higher. I think, you've got a concentration of talent. Even if there was an equivalent amount of talent in an earlier era, the degree of concentration in the leading clubs and the leading competitions is much, much greater. Because, you only have to look at what people's wage bills and turnovers are, because the nature of the system at the moment is to concentrate money, right at the top is the 1%. And it's a global transfer market that is more open and more global than ever before. So again, the Premier League's got, players from 63 countries.
Got Cuba now too.
Yeah. So that, you have all of that. I think the calibre of coaching and the sophistication of coaching and the sort of, the scale of coaching, when you think actually what a coaching staff is and does at the leading clubs, and the use of analytics, I think, has had an impact.
Isn't that an inherent tension in your book, though, between celebrating... I mean, we are in a golden age of football. It's really good to watch, and also there are some really magnetic characters involved, and some of the players are extraordinary, and all of this. But it's inescapable reading your book to see how that has happened on the back of some really murky stuff.
Yeah.
Also, that there are vast swathes of everywhere else that are being left behind.
Yeah.
And is it almost not a problem to say, well, you know, we're living in a golden age of football. We should, you know, what's happening on the pitch is bloody great. But all of this other stuff is, you know, how can we enjoy what's happening there, given how cognizant we are of what's happening everywhere else and off the pitch?
The question about Qatar as well, maybe we should talk about that, because I mean, you could frame what Alex has just said around that single issue. Yeah. How do you enjoy the 2022 World Cup in Qatar?
Yeah.
Sure.
Is it possible to separate the part of you that enjoys great football from the part of you which is horrified?
Sure. I mean, enjoyment is a complicated thing, as I would say, and the way one consumes and experiences football is, you know, for me, is pretty multi-level. I mean, let me answer your question first. Like, well, welcome to 21st century capitalism. Like, what is true of football is true of innumerable things. We're all, you know, locked into networks of consumption and production that are super globalized, super exploitative, with enormous numbers of negative consequences. I mean, you know, every time I, you know, use my mobile phone, you know, or my computer, I mean, you know, who dug up the coltan in some artisan mine in the DRC, sweating and dying for pennies to make this thing? I mean, you know, this is an intractable problem that we place at every level, you know, particularly here in the heart, you know, in the heart of London, one of the kind of peaks of kind of global capitalism and consumerism. So we, you know, football's, you know, this goes for a lot of stuff. I feel very ambiguous about it. Of course I feel ambiguous about it. And, you know, I enormously enjoyed, you know, Tottenham's run in the Champions League last year at an emotional level, at a kind of sort of, you know, tactical, nerdy level, as a spectacle in all sorts of ways, tied to my whole kind of, you know, a lifetime of following Tottenham. But I'm also completely cognizant at the same time that this is a kind of deeply problematic, sceptical, and a deeply problematic global business model.
Is that part of why you write this stuff? Is to resolve that tension in some way? I
don't expect, is it resolvable? I mean, I'm not interested, or I don't...
Resolve it internally. Make yourself comfortable to a degree with your consumption of football and your participation in the spectacle by being one of the people who brings this stuff to the fore so that the rest of us know about it.
I think sort of that's definitely part of it. I mean, it's to, you know, that's a very didactic kind of way of thinking about it. I suppose my mission is to encourage people to put on a different set of spectacles sometimes. You know, I think that's, as we should do when we think about what we eat, you know, and the kind of networks of agriculture and ecology and the consequences of that. Sometimes you need to put on a different pair of spectacles as well as like enjoying stuffing yourself. And that's what I encourage people to do. I also think there is, you know, the negative consequences will grow and grow. You know, there is, it's a deal with the devil. You know, if you're going to have, you know, the kind of extraordinary peak performances of the spectacle in global and European football, eventually, in all sorts of ways, one pays a price, because the way I would put it is, you know, football in the end is a game. It's a game, it's a form of play. That's why we like it. You know, it's actually not about money and power in the end. You know, there is deep in all football cultures a sense that, you know, valor or grit or skill or talent or outrageous luck, you know, should determine events. And if it's determined by money or power, then like, what is this? Then it's bullying or power games. It's not a game at that point. And I think that's an incredibly powerful and important thing. You know, we live in a world where the imperatives of political and economic power are constantly shaping all our value judgments and our lives, you know, and here's an alternative register of values that resists that is actually deeply pervasive. And if people value that, then we need to do something about it, you know, because there are forces at work and patterns of change at work already, as you say, you know, that have wrought their effect in Africa. But there's more of that to come. I mean, a whole series of problematic things, you know, corruption, oligarchy, abuse of political power, control of the spectacle itself. I mean, scale, you know, when you've got Manchester City contemplating facial recognition technology, you know, as a way of getting into the stadium, you know, what is going on here? I find that deeply and powerfully disturbing. That should be contemplated.
Presumably we kind of know why they're doing that though, don't we? I mean, isn't it like a excusable dry run for testing stuff that may be used elsewhere?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and also, you know, they want to have, as the Qataris at PSG have had, a very direct control of who they let in and who they don't let in, and to control what goes on in the stadium. And to, you know, again, if one values spontaneity, if one values, you know, grassroots popular creation of the atmosphere and the meaning of football, which is part of the extraordinary appeal of it, then these things have to be resisted and challenged. And I think, you know, pointing them out is the first stage in doing so.
The Tifo Football Podcast is supported by The Athletic, the best place to read about sports online, whether it is... This is the bit where we talk about one. Alex,
yes.
What is it?
Well, so I picked out Matt Woosnam's piece.
It's Woosnam.
What?
I'm just putting my hands up in the air and going, it's Woosnam. I like Matt Woosnam.
Oh. Is that why you've invited him on our next podcast?
That's why he's on the next episode.
Podcast.
So we're talking about this now, and we'll be talking much more about Crystal Palace on the next episode with Matt. But this one's very interesting, isn't it?
So it's a general piece on how to accommodate Wilfried Zaha in Palace's lineup. He's a very good dynamic attacking player when he's played wide. However, that gives Palace defensive issues because he's not fantastic defending, and obviously Wan-Bissaka's no longer behind him to provide a degree of solidity there. So he's kind of being played off a second striker. Is it working? Woosnam contends not, I think rightly in my opinion. What's really interesting here is this one particular sentence that I really liked. The problem becomes how to accommodate a player who doesn't truly fit the formation, but who is nevertheless the most likely to win you games when he does play. And this, again, I mean, it kind of chimes with the Sebastian Haller video that we released today.
Haller.
Sebastian Haller.
Exactly.
Where, you know, maybe a formational change is the best way to get the most out of him. You know, what happens when a club has a kind of mercurial talent who maybe wants to leave also, but who doesn't fit the natural system? So
it's a conundrum.
It is a conundrum. Matt goes through a couple of the possible options,
I tell you
which are interesting.
I'm going to talk to Matt about this on the next episode. So do sign up to The Athletic, www.theathletic.co.uk/Tifo, 8p a day. You get the 30-day free trial, so you can have 30 days to decide whether or not you like it. You absolutely will. Read some of Matt's pieces, because the next episode we'll be talking to him about exactly what you were just about to say. So thank you for listening. We're back to David Goldblatt now, and thank you, of course, to Matt Woosnam and The Athletic. Can we talk about Qatar?
Of course we can.
Specifically, what I want to know from you, and I think this is subjective to everyone, is... I mean, there are two different ways of looking at the tournament being hosted there. One of them is that it shouldn't be allowed to be, as a result of the various and significant human rights atrocities that have occurred before this, and building the stadiums and all the rest of it. The other is that it should be hosted there because that is, you know, pragmatically the best way to embrace a different culture and to maybe liberalise, for want of a better term, a place like Qatar over a longer period of time through togetherness rather than through, I'm looking for the
exclusion.
term. Exclusion, yeah. Where do you stand on that? And is there an answer to that question?
I think the first thing to say is it should be in Qatar because it's time that the Arab-speaking world and the Islamic world staged one of the world's great sporting mega events. You know, Africa has had a World Cup, Latin America has had an Olympics, obviously Asia has hosted a World Cup and many Olympic Games, and the Middle East loves football on a scale that is comparable with anywhere in this world, if not more so. I mean, the way in which it is woven into both political life and popular culture is really extraordinary. And if football and global sports of universalising language and aims are to carry weight, then it's absolutely time for that to be recognised. I mean, in a better and different world, you know, the Iran-Iraq joint World Cup would really be the one because, you know, you have extraordinary grassroots culture and fervour for football in both of those countries. But that's not happening. So when Qatar first won the bid, that was my first thought. I thought, well, sure, there's all sorts of reasons to have issue with this, but that's a really good case, you know, for doing it. I think the second thing about Qatar, how can I put it, that interests me that, you know, is that because it's in the winter, the Northern Hemisphere winter, it's going to be a very different kind of World Cup. I mean, because, you know, what's just extraordinary about the World Cup as a global event is not what's happening even in the stadiums or the host nation. It's the way it triggers the most extraordinary, you know, collective experiences and physical gatherings everywhere else around the world. And it's going to be the winter in the Northern Hemisphere, so that's not going to be happening. People are not going to go out in the cold in the same way. And then there's the question of public space in Qatar itself as well, because that's what has made, I think, been fascinating about the last few World Cups is the degree to which the occupation of public space by both hosts and their visitors is an integral part of it. And the arrival of social media on a global scale means people are experiencing, you know, that public space in some sense vicariously. And what is public space in Qatar? They don't know. You know, it's so not designed for that. I mean, in terms of, you know, human rights and I mean, this goes for like which World Cup and which, you know, to defend the Qataris at this level, which World Cup and which Olympics would pass muster on those questions. I mean, really, China in 2008, you know, or
Argentina.
Argentina 1978. Yeah. I mean, there's lots of, you know, Russia 2014. Yeah. I mean, we can come back to, 2018. And indeed, you know, we know that all of the, you know, World Cups since at least 1998 have had well dodgy bidding procedures.
Is there a scale though?
Is there scale? I mean, I think where the scale comes is not on the dodginess of the bid, but on the working conditions of the people. I mean, that's the number one problematic issue.
Yeah.
And I think there is, you know, it's worth remembering the scale of what's going on in Qatar. So they're spending something in the region of 250 to 300 billion, which is more than every World Cup combined before. In fact, it's probably more than every World Cup and every Olympic Games combined.
Does this include their new city and stuff that's going to be used afterwards? You know,
well,
the 2030
vision thing? The lines, like everything in Qatar, between, you know, World Cup and other stuff, public and private, you know, ruling family and state, it's all very blurred. So, you know, they are building an entirely new urban zone, you know, to accommodate two stadiums. And so the workforce is truly gigantic. And the working conditions have been absolutely outrageous. and we have a situation, I calculate that even if we have no further fatalities between now and 2022, and depending on how much extra time gets played in the knockout stages, we're looking at a fatality per minute of football played, of Nepalese, Bangladeshi, Indian, Pakistani, predominantly Sri Lankan workers. And yeah, that's a real problem. I mean, I am struggling at that level. I mean, so what one can say in defence of the Qataris, and we'll see how this plays out, is that you really actually have had a shift in Qatari working practices and Qatari policy as a consequence of the World Cup. The pressure has not come from FIFA. The pressure has come, paradoxically, from the boycott organised and the sort of, breaking of transport links by the Saudi and UAE-led coalition, who are trying to put, Qatar in their place in the regional politics of the Middle East. And that has made the Qataris more exposed. They need more allies outside of the region, put the spotlight on them. They need to differentiate themselves from what's going on in Saudi Arabia. And so you had, with the support of the ILO, the International Trade Union Movement, a number of human rights said, okay, if you do these reforms that you're saying you're going to do, this is in 2018, then this is good with us. The problem in football, as we know, is that it's the hope that kills you. I mean, I am sceptical, given how these things usually work out, that the degree and depth of reform, both in health and safety practices, but also the inequities of the Khalifa system, the bondage, effectively having your passport removed, of being, a ward in effect of a local gangmaster who controls everything about your life, etc. We'll see. So there is a case to say, well, the way it's worked out is that, there may well be actually some change and some lasting change that is positive, albeit at a very high price of blood. But I am sceptical, and I think that's something we all have to sort of resolve with Qatar. But I wouldn't want to make them, this goes for pretty much, let's think about watching the 2022 Winter Games in Beijing, given what's been happening to the Uyghurs over the last, year. How much, that's like, repression on a truly industrial scale. So I'm mixed about it, at best, and I do think it is. We'll see how I feel, but I think, it's just worth bearing in mind that there has been these promises of change. We will see. But again, this is about one's got to keep one's eye on it. That's how these people get away with it all the time. Is you say stuff and then everyone forgets about it, and then you take the pressure needs to continue.
And this, I spoke to James Montague about this not too long ago, and he said something similar, which was. He said that were it not for the 2022 World Cup in Qatar, the greater world, the vast majority of us would have no idea what the kafala system even was. And just by virtue of having a World Cup there, you've already taught the rest of us about this thing, and therefore various public pressure, which has led to supposed reforms. I think many of which are already failing or have already been kind of illuminated as having not gone very far or not been seen through. But the counter argument to that is that practices that have been long held take a long time for people who've been holding them for a long time to loosen the grip. So maybe we will see, and maybe the legacy of 2022 will be different. But the book doesn't just focus on Africa, for example. There's various focuses. Would you tell us what was your favourite bit to research, your favourite bit to write, the favourite story that features in the book without giving it all away? The
favourite bit to write was to write about what's been happening at FIFA and in the governance of global football.
What has been happening? Do tell us, David.
Well, systemic and endemic corruption. Football is endemically corrupt absolutely everywhere in the world. I mean, and again, that is not entirely new, but the scale, the scope, the form of it, again, is historically unprecedented. And while there are lots of local reasons and local variants of corruption, the fish rots from the head. And their most magnificent leadership has been given by the leading football institutions, above all FIFA, which to some extent then imploded in 2015 with the biggest scandals, the biggest investigations, the biggest changing of the guard that global football governance has had in 50, 60 years. And the fall of Sepp Blatter is the moment to sort of, around which to explore that, which happens in 2015. So what I enjoyed about that most was there are a lot of great investigative work done by very good journalists, from Andrew Jennings, without which none of this would be possible. His contribution politically and journalistically is without peer, to David Conn's work, who did a superb kind of like try and put it all together survey for all of the House of FIFA, because there are so many dimensions to this corruption and so many geographical kind of variants, connection between them all. So I thought there's no point trying to sort of repeat that. How can I sort of write about this in a way that is illuminating without just repeating other people? And what I chanced upon was, of course, FIFA's movie about itself, which is called. Have you
with
watched
Gerard
it?
Depardieu, yeah.
With Gerard Depardieu as Jules Rimet and Sam Leith as Havelange, but best of all, Tim Roth as Sepp Blatter. And the film,
great career move.
It's $30 million is what it cost to make, so a low end for Hollywood, but nonetheless high production values. 28 million from FIFA's coffers themselves, 2 million from the Azerbaijani Film Foundation, who could see a good thing coming. And it's called United Passions, and obviously it got slated in the press when it was released and got quite a lot of coverage. But I thought, I'm actually going to watch this movie. So I sat down and watched it, and on the one hand, it is absolutely the worst movie ever made, but it is simultaneously an absolute gem. And it's a gem because I'm watching it, I'm going, how did this script get written? How did this insane melange get made? What is going on here? I thought, all the money has come direct from the president's office. And the guys who are writing this script know nothing about football. And the audience basically is one man. And having met Sepp Blatter on a number of occasions and heard him speak and followed him over the years, I thought, this is Sepp's version of the world, or as I call him, Uncle Sepp. And I said, it's like, this is the version told by your incredibly irritating uncle on a Sunday lunchtime, a lifetime of Sunday lunchtimes, in which he misremembers and miscalculates, family history and turns it to his advantage. And here we go again. And that's what's gone on. They've taken script notes from Blatter sitting in his office late at night, and it is his version. He's been concocting this version of his own rise and of FIFA's purpose for the last 30 years, and someone's now going to make the Hollywood movie version of it. And having seen that, you can decode actually the film in a really interesting way to reveal what the real history of FIFA was. And as I watched it, I thought, the thing is, partly the problem with this movie is that it is the ravings of your self-serving drunken uncle. But the real problem is they've tried to make a Hollywood biography here. And for 30 million, do you know what? They could have made a series of The Wire. And that is the format in which the story of FIFA actually should have been told. So I had an enormous amount of fun thinking about, if you made the history of FIFA as a version of The Wire, How would that look?
Well, have you spoken to Netflix yet? I mean, you're the guy, right? You're the guy to. I think the same thing with the whole history of the Qatar World Cup, the whole history of the region. If you had 10 episodes, hour long, to explain these things, wouldn't that make the most incredible television?
I think, you know...
What are we doing here?
You're going to need some great lawyers, but I think it's got real potential. No, I thought, you could do a whole series on Latin America and the rise of Joao Havelange, which would be, the backstory, because that's actually the moment at which corruption in FIFA and the way power is wielded within global football takes its current form. I mean, he is the master. I mean, that's the hysterical thing about United Passions, is that Blatter, FIFA, Havelange is rendered as a sort of visionary fool, and the man really getting all the work done is Uncle Sepp. And this, of course, is complete nonsense, because the master of power was Joao Havelange, and they tell the story as if Blatter is the man who does the deals with Coca-Cola that launch FIFA into the world of commercialism. And you're going, no, dude, this is Havelange. You're being trained up as a servile replacement for the current General Secretary doing your time at Adidas's political unit, as it was known. Horst Dassler's operation, the man who invented much of this kind of politics. But Blatter tells, you can see it's Blatter's story that you're getting in the film. So there's sort of multiple levels of which you have to kind of reinterpret to understand, why is it looking like this? So yeah, there's a lot of potential. I'd love to do a one on how does the money move? How does that actually work? How does bribery really happen in this world?
It's leaving watches in hotel rooms, isn't it? Mostly.
Well, that's and
I mean, it's still.
Sepp wants his watches back. Yeah. Have you seen? He's been complaining that he left like 30 really good watches
just lying around
in his office that were personal presents to him over his many years as president. So if you're figuring $25,000, for a kind of serious Swiss watch, we're talking about tens of, millions of dollars worth of watch, and he wants them back. I mean, the man is. I mean, that's the other, dimension to which I enjoyed writing about. That is that the way in which power corrupts and dilutes, and how so many people at the top of football, they can't. What's the point at which you start believing your own story that not to be true?
But there's such an easy myth as well, isn't there, to sell yourself, which is that I'm using this global sporting phenomenon to transform the world for the better. And it's a really kind of empowering and exciting idea.
Well, Sepp Blatter has that. I mean, one of his crowning achievements is the situation with Palestine, which is something which he can, genuinely lean to as a something which improved football as far as he saw it. And I'm sure with all of those men as well.
The accession of Palestine to FIFA is 98, and Havelange is still in charge.
Okay, but Sepp Blatter totally claims it as his.
Blatter has a kind of... he's a split personality. He's a compartmentalizer. There's part of him that really does believe all of that
stuff. This is what I mean.
And then there's another bit of him that knows where all the bodies are buried and what has gone on.
There's a parallel there to how we were talking about watching football with two different minds, right?
Yeah.
Sepp Blatter is also a split person. We must remember that he probably does love football, right?
I think he does love football. I think he loves power and status more. I mean, that's for sure. I think he loves himself more.
And watches.
He likes watches.
He really wants them back.
He likes, he's quite a charismatic person. I mean, you don't get to that position and have that much power without developing some of that. I mean, he's also sort of nauseatingly disingenuous, with his slightly folksy Swiss uncle twinkle in his eye kind of vibe.
But you also love your uncle, however irritating.
Yeah, I've got beyond the love, actually.
Sure,
I think in the end, I mean, he had a sort of, a slight cosmopolitanism that you don't find in some football officials. I thought his defence of the Vuvuzela in the World Cup in 2010 was a very good thing. And he sort of does, in his own strangely sort of Swiss provincial way, get Africa a bit, and has a kind of rapport with African football. But yeah, this is a man who knows where the bodies were buried. This is a man who, orchestrated the payment of absolutely outrageous inflated wages and pensions to himself and the three leading officials, where we just sign off on our own wages. It was like pulling in 20 million a year. I mean, okay, it's official, it's okay, but it's like, really?
But I mean, going back a little bit to what we were saying before about the state of football currently, in terms of its quality, in terms of its global appeal, and was it almost the permissiveness and the corruption of FIFA that has allowed it to become this thing?
Satellite television is the most important thing,
right?
I think, and the transformation of, technologically, that is simply the most important thing, because, the kind of scale of audiences that you can generate, and the kind of money that you can generate from pay-per-view television, which may not be the future, but has certainly been, for the last 25, 30 years, that is the singularly most important thing.
Does that shift power towards the clubs and away from the governing bodies to a degree that ultimately might see the clubs turning around and going, do you know what, you do need to smarten up your act, we can't behave like this, so you guys, I mean, Man City, Liverpool, Man United, Arsenal, they all get together and go to UEFA and say,
I mean, as we know from football leagues, Manchester City and PSG in particular have been incredibly effective in shaping what UEFA do. If you can, run the thing or influence it to that degree, which I think they did in the way they've been treated over financial fair play, why do you need to leave? If you're actually pulling the strings, so you've got that much kind of weight. I think that clubs, clearly the top clubs, do have more power. I mean, I don't think that's, an issue not just in relationship to UEFA, but also, lower leagues, lower football clubs, the rest of the whole, football. I mean, when we say football, it's worth remembering, often it's shorthand for, the peak of the men's professional game. And there's a lot more going on. And I think that even at the super clubs, even with their current ownership, they continue to trade on an idea that they're part of something bigger, that they're this, it's not just kind of mechanized show business here, that somehow we are part of a bigger organic whole that stretches, from the peak performances of the male professional spectacle to women's football to the grassroots to informal football, which is what makes football somehow stand for more than just people kicking a ball or just making money. Because if that were what the public, and consumers believed, then it wouldn't work. So they have they leave all of that behind at their peril, I think. Which is why I don't think you've seen, despite, I think we're coming up for 30 years since Berlusconi first started agitating for a European Super League. I actually don't see it happening, because there is that kind of wider sort of cultural break for even the most kind of ambitious, power-driven or profit-driven clubs and club owners. They know that actually what they have is quite fragile cultural capital, and you mess with it at your peril.
Well, one of the best run clubs in the Premier League is Liverpool, in terms of performance, but also in terms of the sheer intelligence of their owners and the resources they can put behind it, and in terms of what they're doing on social media and the kind of narrative that they're putting forward. They are profoundly rooting themselves in the idea of Liverpool just being a really good, successful community club. It's absolutely crucial to their self-identity.
Yeah.
So you can't see that changing.
I mean, well, it could change because people make mistakes and you can destroy things. So I'm not saying at Liverpool, but sure, I think more generally, things can be. It's easy for things to be screwed up. and squandered. I mean, I wonder what will eventually happen to Manchester City in that regard, who, I have at one level enormous affection for, as the team of the heart and soul, the real Manchester, the city of, the 90s in the third division where, they're going 7-0 down and then they sing We Won What 8. Yeah, exactly.
How can you not
and
love
longer,
Sean
and like a deeper, richer history of also being successful at times, and a lot of great football being played there in the late 60s and the early 70s. And just a version of Manchester that is appealing. And I wonder, so far, that hasn't been extinguished in Manchester or amongst the club's fans. But how long can it last? And I do wonder whether these things are indestructible. I'm not convinced that they are.
We could probably talk to you all day, but we've talked for about an hour now, so maybe we should wrap things up. But thank you so much for coming in. Really appreciate it. The Age of Football. Do you want to hold it up again for the people watching, Alex?
I'm going to hold up both.
Oh, we're holding up The Ball Is Round 2.
Buy these books.
You're so bad at holding things in front of a camera.
Well, I'm trying to do two things at once.
Perfect.
Right.
Lovely.
So this one's out already. Go and buy that.
That's The Ball Is Round.
This one's out in September 5th.
September the 5th.
The Age
Buy
of
it when
Football.
it comes out.
Please do. David, thank you. Thank you again.
And my pleasure. Thank you.